Sophia wiped down another table at Bellini's restaurant, her back aching after 8 straight hours on her feet. The fancy Manhattan restaurant catered to people who spent more on a single meal than she made in 2 days. Still, the tips were good, and right now, that's what mattered most. "Table 12 needs more wine," barked Hector, the floor manager who never seemed to remember the word, "please." Sophia nodded and hurried to the wine station. As she carefully poured the deep red liquid into crystal glasses worth more than her monthly grocery budget, she allowed herself a small daydream. In her mind, her fingers weren't wrapped around a wine bottle but dancing across piano keys. The music room at Juilliard. A real stage someday. "Hurry up, we don't have all night," Hector snapped, yanking her back to reality. Sophia carried the wine tray with practiced care toward table 12, where Richard Harrington sat with 3 business associates. She recognized him immediately. Everyone who worked at Bellini's knew Richard, the tech billionaire who owned half a dozen companies and never let anyone forget it. "Your wine, gentlemen," Sophia said with her practiced restaurant smile. "Finally," Richard said without looking up from his phone. "I was beginning to think you'd gone to harvest the grapes yourself." His friends chuckled on cue. Sophia maintained her smile as she poured, keeping her eyes down. She'd learned that rich men like Richard preferred servers who disappeared when not needed. "Have you worked here long?" asked one of Richard's guests, surprising Sophia. People like this rarely asked her anything about herself. "About 6 months, sir," she answered, finishing the last pour. Richard finally looked up, his eyes sharp as he assessed her. "Saving up for college, I assume? Or paying off student loans for some useless arts degree?" The way he said it made it clear he thought either option was equally foolish. Sophia felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her expression neutral. "Just making a living," she replied evenly. Something in her tone must have caught Richard's interest. He studied her more closely now. "You're different from the other servers here," he said. It wasn't a compliment. Sophia said nothing, waiting to be dismissed. She had 3 other tables waiting, and her feet were killing her. But Richard wasn't finished with her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophia Martinez." "Well, Sophia Martinez, what do you do when you're not serving overpriced wine to people like me?" His friends looked uncomfortable now, as if Richard had broken some unspoken rule about not acknowledging that service workers had lives outside their jobs. Sophia hesitated. She never discussed her personal life with customers, but something about Richard's challenging tone made her speak. "I practice piano when I can." Richard's eyebrows shot up. "Piano, how quaint. Classical, I presume?" "Yes," Sophia said, wishing she'd kept her mouth shut. "Any good?" Richard pressed. One of his friends laughed nervously. "Richard, let the poor girl get back to work." But Richard waved him off. "I'm curious. Are you any good, Sophia?" Sophia met his eyes directly for the first time. "I was once." Something flickered across Richard's face. Interest, maybe, or the spark of an idea forming. Before he could respond, Hector appeared at her side. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Harrington?" he asked, shooting Sophia a look that clearly said, "Get back to work." "Everything's fine," Richard said dismissively. "Sophia and I were just discussing her hidden talents." Sophia took this opportunity to slip away, feeling Richard's eyes on her back as she left. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of orders, plates, and fake smiles. By the time she clocked out at midnight, she'd nearly forgotten the strange interaction. The night air felt good on her skin as she walked to the subway station. Sophia pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders. October in New York had a bite to it, and winter was coming. She'd need to pick up extra shifts soon if she wanted to keep her tiny apartment heated. The subway car was nearly empty this late. Sophia sank into a seat and closed her eyes, letting the rocking motion soothe her tired body. Just 3 more stops, then a 5-minute walk, and she could finally collapse into bed. In her apartment, a studio barely big enough for a bed and mini fridge, Sophia kicked off her shoes and fell onto her mattress fully dressed. She should shower, should eat something, should practice piano on the small keyboard she kept propped against the wall, but exhaustion won out, and she drifted to sleep with her work clothes still on. Morning came too soon. Sophia's alarm jangled her awake at 5:30 a.m. For a moment she considered calling in sick, but she couldn't afford to miss a day's pay. With a groan, she forced herself up and into the shower. The community center didn't open until 6 a.m., but Mrs. Patel, the elderly woman who managed the building, Always let Sophia in early. Good morning. Dear, Mrs. Patel said, unlocking the side entrance. You're looking tired today. Late shift, Sophia explained. You work too hard, Mrs. Patel clucked, but she said this every morning. The piano room is all yours until 7:30. Someone booked it for children's lessons after that. Thank you, Sophia said gratefully, heading down the hallway. The piano room was actually a repurposed storage closet. The upright piano inside had seen better days. Several keys stuck, and the middle C had a permanent twang. But it was a real piano with weighted keys, not her apartment keyboard that felt like plastic under her fingers. Sophia sat on the bench, closed her eyes, and began her warm-up scales. Her fingers remembered what to do even as her mind drifted. She'd been playing since she was 4 years old, when her mother had scraped together enough money for a second-hand piano and lessons from the church organist. For 12 years, piano had been her life. Competitions, recitals, talk of scholarships in music schools. Then her mother got sick and the piano had to be sold to pay medical bills. By the time her mother recovered, the scholarship opportunities had passed, and life became about survival rather than dreams. Sophia transitioned smoothly into Debussy's Clair de Lune, her fingers finding the gentle, flowing notes that always calmed her spirit. Here, in this tiny room with its imperfect piano, she could still touch that other life, the one where she performed on real stages instead of serving drinks to men like Richard Harrington. When she finished, she realized she wasn't alone. Mrs. Patel stood in the doorway, her eyes misty. That was beautiful, child, she said. Such talent shouldn't be hidden away in a closet at 6 a.m. Sophia smiled sadly. Life doesn't always work out the way we plan, Mrs. Patel. Not yet, perhaps, the older woman replied. But your story isn't finished. After another hour of practice, Sophia left for her morning shift at the coffee shop 3 blocks from Bellini's. From 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., she served lattes and muffins to rushed commuters, then had just enough time to change clothes before starting her evening shift at the restaurant at 4 hours. Bellini's was quieter on weeknights, which usually meant smaller tips but easier work. Sophia was surprised to see Richard Harrington seated alone at a corner table when she arrived. Even more surprising was that he'd been seated in her section. She approached his table with caution. Good evening, Mr. Harrington. Can I get you something to drink? Richard looked up from his tablet. Ah, the pianist, he said, as if they were old acquaintances. Scotch, neat. The Macallan 25. Sophia nodded and turned to get his drink. Wait, Richard said. She paused. I have a proposition for you. Sophia's guard went up immediately. She'd been propositioned by wealthy customers before, and it never ended well. Richard must have read her expression. Not that kind of proposition, he said, looking almost offended. A job offer. I have a job, Sophia replied. A second job, Richard clarified. I'm hosting a charity gala at my penthouse next Saturday. The pay is $500 for one evening of serving drinks and canapes. Interested? Sophia did the math quickly. $500 was nearly a week's wages from both her jobs combined. It would cover most of next month's rent. Why me? She asked suspiciously. You could hire professional event staff. Richard shrugged. I like to mix things up. Keep life interesting. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out. Here's the details. Let me know by tomorrow. Sophia hesitated, then took the envelope. Now, about that scotch, Richard said, turning back to his tablet, clearly considering their conversation finished. As Sophia walked away, she felt the weight of the envelope in her pocket. $500. It could be the start of her Juilliard application fund, or it could pay for the winter boots she desperately needed. What she didn't know was that Richard Harrington never did anything without ulterior motives. And as she fetched his expensive scotch, he was already sending texts to his inner circle about the entertainment he had planned for his upcoming party, entertainment, that would center around the waitress who thought she was a pianist. Sophia stared at the address on the invitation for the 5th time. The building stretched toward the sky, all gleaming glass and polished stone. People like her cleaned places like this. They didn't get invited inside. She adjusted the plain black dress she'd borrowed from her neighbor, Louisa. The fabric was a little tight across the shoulders and slightly too long, but it was the closest thing to formal wear she could find on short notice. At least the sensible black shoes she wore for restaurant shifts would work for tonight, too. Checking in for the Harrington event, she told the doorman, trying to sound like she belonged. I'm Staffy. The doorman consulted his tablet. Sophia Martinez? Yes. Service elevator is that way, he said, pointing to a discreet side entrance. Floor 50. The service elevator was surprisingly plush, nicer than any elevator in any building Sophia had ever lived in. As it climbed smoothly upward, her stomach knotted with anxiety. $500, she reminded herself. It was worth the discomfort. When the doors opened, she found herself in a busy kitchen where a dozen people in catering uniforms rushed about. A harried-looking woman with a clipboard spotted her. You must be the extra server Mr. Harrington requested. I'm Diane, event coordinator. She gave Sophia a critical once-over. You'll do. Ever worked an event like this before? No, but I'm a quick learner. Diane thrust a small tray at her. These are the signature cocktails. Blue is vodka-based, pink is gin. Circulate through the main room, but stay away from the string quartet until they finish their set. Staff restroom is through there if you need it. No phone use, no eating, and absolutely no chatting with the guests unless they initiate conversation. Clear? Clear, Sophia echoed, taking the tray. And whatever you do, don't break anything. Some of these glasses cost more than your paycheck. With that encouraging send-off, Sophia was directed toward the main event space. She paused in the doorway, momentarily stunned by the opulence before her. Richard Harrington's penthouse was larger than the entire floor of her apartment building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, now glittering as dusk settled. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over guests in designer clothes, their jewelry catching and reflecting tiny rainbows across the room. In one corner, 4 musicians in formal attire played classical music on string instruments, and dominating the far wall stood a magnificent grand piano, its gleaming black surface untouched like an art installation rather than an instrument meant to be played. Sophia tore her eyes away from the piano and focused on her task. She moved carefully through the crowd, offering drinks and doing her best to blend into the background. Most guests took cocktails without really seeing her, continuing their conversations as if she were invisible. There you are. Sophia turned to find Richard Harrington watching her, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He wore a tuxedo that probably cost more than her yearly rent, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. Good evening, Mr. Harrington, she said politely. Having fun yet? He asked. I'm working, sir. Of course you are. Richard reached out and straightened one of the glasses on her tray, though it didn't need straightening. I see you noticed my Steinway. Beautiful, isn't it? Sophia's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the piano. Yes, sir. It's gorgeous, custom made, cost nearly $500,000. Richard watched her face as he said this, as if gauging her reaction. Do you know what the funny thing is? I don't even play. Not a single note. It's purely decorative. Sophia said nothing, unsure where this conversation was going. It seems wasteful, doesn't it? Richard continued. Such a fine instrument never being used. Before Sophia could respond, a woman in a slinky gold dress appeared at Richard's side, slipping her arm through his possessively. Richard, darling, you promised to introduce me to the senator, the woman said, giving Sophia a dismissive glance. In a moment, Vivian, Richard replied, but allowed himself to be pulled away. Over his shoulder, he called back to Sophia. We'll talk more later. Sophia exhaled slowly, relieved to be released from his unsettling attention. Something about the way he'd mentioned the piano made her nervous. For the next hour, she circulated with her tray, refilling it when necessary, and keeping to the shadows as much as possible. She overheard snippets of conversations about vacation homes, stock portfolios, and charity board positions, topics from a world she could barely imagine. During a brief break in the kitchen, she overheard 2 catering staff talking. Did you see the way Mr. Harrington was watching that server girl? One said. The one he specifically requested? Yeah, weird, right? Vivian looked ready to claw someone's eyes out. I heard him tell his buddy something about a special entertainment planned for tonight. Sophia's hand froze in the act of arranging fresh cocktails on her tray. Maybe she's a singer or something? The first server suggested. Whatever it is, I hope we get to watch. His parties are usually boring as hell. Sophia slipped away before they noticed her, a cold feeling spreading through her chest. Special entertainment. What had she gotten herself into? Back in the main room, The atmosphere had grown more festive as the alcohol flowed freely. The string quartet was playing something lively now, though few people seemed to be paying attention to the music. Sophia noticed Richard and his inner circle gathered near the piano, occasionally glancing in her direction and laughing. She was refilling her tray when Diane appeared beside her. "Mr. Harrington wants all staff in the main room in 5 minutes, she informed Sophia. "He's making some kind of announcement." "Did he say what about?" "No, and I didn't ask. When you're paid what he pays, you just smile and nod." 5 minutes later, Sophia stood with the other staff along one wall as Richard stepped into the center of the room. He clinked a spoon against his glass and the room gradually quieted. "Friends, colleagues, esteemed guests," Richard began, his voice carrying easily across the space. "Thank you all for coming tonight and for your generous donations to the Harrington Foundation." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. "Before we continue with our evening, I'd like to thank our wonderful string quartet for their performance." He gestured toward the musicians who nodded in acknowledgement. "True artists, wouldn't you agree?" More applause, "But I've arranged something special for you tonight. A little unexpected entertainment." His eyes found Sophia against the wall. "You see, I recently discovered that one of our servers is a pianist." A murmur of confusion spread through the room. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face as dozens of eyes turned toward the staff line, trying to identify which server Richard meant. "Sophia," Richard called, extending his hand toward her. "Come join me, please." For a moment, Sophia considered running. She could drop her tray, dash for the service elevator, and never look back. But that would mean no payment, and she desperately needed that money. On shaky legs, she set down her tray and walked toward Richard. The crowd parted to let her through, curious eyes examining her from every side. "Sophia here tells me she's quite accomplished at the piano," Richard announced, placing a hand on her shoulder that felt heavy as lead. When I heard that, I thought, what better way to make use of my Steinway than to let real talent play it for once? Sophia looked up at him in horror. "Mr. Harrington, I can't—" "Don't be modest," he cut her off, steering her toward the piano. "I'm sure everyone would love to hear you play. Wouldn't you all?" The guests murmured agreement, though most looked confused or embarrassed by the awkward situation. The string quartet exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with this turn of events. "Mr. Harrington," Sophia whispered urgently, "I haven't played on a real piano in years. I practice on a keyboard in my apartment, and sometimes at a community center. I can't perform here." Richard leaned down, speaking so only she could hear. "Sure you can. Unless you'd rather forfeit your payment for tonight." Sophia stared at him in disbelief. Now she understood why she'd been hired, not as a server, but as entertainment. Entertainment he clearly expected to fail spectacularly. She glanced around the room, taking in the expectant faces of the wealthy guests. Some looked genuinely curious. Others seemed to be in on Richard's joke, smirking behind their champagne flutes. Vivian, the woman in gold, was openly gloating. "What's it going to be, Sophia?" Richard pressed. "The piano or the door? Though I should warn you, leaving means no payment for your time tonight." Sophia looked at the magnificent Steinway. Despite her fear and anger, she felt its pull. How long had it been since she'd touched a truly fine instrument? The cheap upright at the community center and her apartment keyboard couldn't compare to this. If Richard wanted a show, she'd give him one. It probably wouldn't be good enough for this crowd of music patrons who could afford symphony tickets. But she would play with every ounce of skill she had left. Slowly, she removed the folded server's apron from her waist and handed it to a startled Diane. Then, with her back straight and her chin held high, Sophia walked to the piano bench and sat down. The room fell silent. Sophia stared at the pristine keys before her, gleaming white and black in perfect condition. She took a deep breath, placed her hands in position, and closed her eyes. For a moment, she was transported back to her childhood home, to the worn piano that had been her refuge. She remembered her mother's encouraging smile, the joy of learning a difficult passage, the dreams of concert halls. Then, with Richard's mocking gaze burning into her back, Sophia began to play. The first notes that flowed from Sophia's fingers were tentative, almost apologetic. She began with a simple Bach prelude, one she had played countless times before. It was safe, familiar, something to warm up her fingers and calm her racing heart. From his position near the bar, Richard watched with a satisfied smirk. This was exactly what he'd expected, a waitress stumbling through a basic piece that any child with a few years of lessons could play. He caught Vivian's eye across the room and winked. But then something changed. As the final notes of the prelude faded, Sophia paused. The room remained silent, guests awkwardly holding their drinks, unsure whether to applaud the mediocre performance or wait for more. In that moment of stillness, Sophia made a decision. She straightened her back, positioned her hands once more, and dove into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The opening notes rang out, gentle, questioning, deceptively simple. Then, as the piece progressed, her fingers began to move with increasing confidence and speed. The music swelled, filling the vast room with sounds that seemed impossible from a single instrument. Richard's smirk faded. This wasn't the fumbling attempt he had anticipated. The technical skill required for this piece was beyond most professional pianists. Yet Sophia played with the assurance of someone who had performed it hundreds of times. The string quartet members exchanged wide-eyed glances. The first violinist leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "Conservatory trained, has to be." Around the room, conversations died. Drinks were forgotten in midair. All eyes turned toward the server girl at the piano, whose fingers flew across the keys with impossible precision, coaxing out storms and whispers, joy and heartbreak. Sophia was no longer in the penthouse. She was no longer aware of Richard or his wealthy guests or the beautiful Steinway beneath her fingers. She existed only within the music, a vessel through which Chopin spoke across centuries. Every hour of practice, every sacrifice, every dream deferred, all of it poured through her into this moment. When she reached the thunderous climax of the piece, several guests gasped audibly. The raw emotion and technical brilliance combined into something transcendent. Even Vivian had stopped glaring and now watched with her lips slightly parted in astonishment. As the final notes of the ballade faded, Sophia didn't pause. Without breaking the spell, she transitioned seamlessly into Liszt's La Campanella, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Her hands became a blur, leaping impossible distances across the keyboard, executing trills and runs that seemed to defy human capability. In the back of the room, Richard stood frozen, his face unreadable. This wasn't just good playing. This was virtuoso level, the kind that filled concert halls and sold out symphony seasons. He watched as the very people he'd gathered to witness Sophia's humiliation now stared in awe at her performance. The string quartet's cellist whispered to his colleague, "Who is she?" "I've never seen her at Juilliard or Manhattan School." Near the windows, an elderly man with thick glasses turned to his companion. "I haven't heard La Campanella played this well since Lang Lang performed at Carnegie last spring." Sophia remained unaware of the sensation she was creating. Her entire being focused on the music, on giving voice to the notes that had lived in her mind during years of silence. When her fingers finally stilled after the last triumphant notes of Liszt, the room held its breath for one eternal moment. Then it erupted. Applause thundered through the penthouse. Guests who moments earlier had been prepared to politely endure an amateur performance now rose to their feet, clapping and calling out in appreciation. The string quartet members were among the first standing, their faces alight with professional recognition of exceptional talent. Sophia finally looked up, blinking as if waking from a dream. The standing ovation washed over her like a physical force. She saw astonished faces, genuine smiles, and in some eyes tears of emotion. Her gaze found Richard, still standing by the bar, his face a complex mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something that might have been unwilling admiration. For a moment, Sophia wasn't sure what to do. She had come here as a server, not a performer. Should she stand and bow, return to passing drinks? Instead, she simply nodded her acknowledgement of the applause and made to rise from the bench. "More!" someone called from the crowd. Others joined in, requesting another piece. Sophia hesitated, looking toward Richard. After all, this was his home, his piano, his party. To her surprise, he gave a slight nod. She turned back to the keyboard and began a Debussy piece, Clair de Lune. After the technical fireworks of Liszt, she chose this for its ethereal beauty and deceptive simplicity. The impressionistic harmonies floated through the room, creating a dreamlike atmosphere that held everyone spellbound once more. As she played, the crowd rearranged itself. Guests who had been scattered throughout the room now gathered closer to the piano. The string quartet members positioned themselves where they could watch her hands. Even the catering staff had paused their duties, standing in doorways with trays forgotten in their hands. When Sophia finished the Debussy, the applause was different, not as loud but somehow deeper, more reverent. She stood, giving a small, awkward bow, uncomfortable with the attention but moved by the response. Before she could step away from the piano, the first violinist from the string quartet approached her. "That was extraordinary," he said, his professional demeanor softened by genuine enthusiasm. "Where did you study?" "I didn't," Sophia replied. "Not formally. I had lessons as a child, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain her complicated history with music in this glittering setting. The violinist looked stunned. "Self-taught? That's—" He shook his head in disbelief. "I'm Thomas Chen, associate conductor with the New York Chamber Orchestra. We should talk." He pressed a business card into her hand just as the crowd around them shifted, making way for an older woman with silver hair elegantly styled in a chignon. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Young lady," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of age but losing none of its authority. "I am Eleanor Whitmore." Sophia didn't recognize the name, but several people nearby reacted with widened eyes and whispers. "You've received no formal training?" Mrs. Whitmore asked directly. "No, ma'am. I had a piano teacher until I was 16, but after that I've just practiced when I could." "And where do you practice now? Surely not on that magnificent Steinway." Sophia felt her cheeks warm. "I have a keyboard in my apartment. Sometimes I use the piano at the community center before work." Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "You played Liszt's La Campanella, possibly the most technically challenging piece in the standard repertoire, on a community center piano and a keyboard?" Several people around them murmured in astonishment. "Yes, ma'am," Sophia said simply. Mrs. Whitmore turned to Thomas Chen. "You heard it too, didn't you? It wasn't just my old ears playing tricks." "No tricks," he confirmed. "She's extraordinary." "I sit on the board at Juilliard," Mrs. Whitmore said, turning back to Sophia. "We need to discuss your future, my dear." "Raw talent like yours comes along perhaps once in a generation." Sophia felt dizzy suddenly, as if the floor beneath her feet had shifted. Juilliard, the dream she had abandoned years ago, believing it forever out of reach. "I can't afford—" she began. "Scholarships exist precisely for situations like this," Mrs. Whitmore cut in firmly. "Talent should never be wasted due to financial constraints." As Mrs. Whitmore continued talking about auditions and special admissions processes, Sophia became aware of Richard standing at the edge of the group that had formed around her. His expression was unreadable, but the smug superiority from earlier in the evening had vanished. Their eyes met across the small crowd. For a moment, neither looked away. Then, to Sophia's surprise, Richard gave her a small nod, not of permission or condescension, but of acknowledgement. His plan had backfired spectacularly, but in doing so, it had opened a door Sophia had thought forever closed. Diane, the event coordinator, hovered nearby, clearly unsure how to handle this unexpected turn of events. Was Sophia still on duty? Should she be directed back to serving drinks? But no one was paying attention to their empty glasses now. The atmosphere in the penthouse had transformed completely. What had begun as another predictable society gathering had become something else entirely. The night when a waitress revealed herself to be a musical prodigy, and a cruel joke transformed into a moment of genuine discovery. As discussions swirled around her about auditions and opportunities, Sophia felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not just the small hopes that had sustained her through double shifts and exhaustion, hope for paying rent on time or affording new shoes, but the grand, expansive hope of a life aligned with passion rather than mere survival. And it had all begun with a wealthy man's attempt to humiliate her for his own amusement. The irony wasn't lost on Sophia. As she stood in the center of a attention that had never been meant to flatter her, she wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would these promises evaporate in the cold light of day? Would these important people forget about the waitress pianist once the novelty wore off? But for tonight, at least, in this moment, Sophia allowed herself to believe that her life might be about to change in ways she had stopped daring to imagine. The morning after the party, Sophia woke in her tiny apartment, momentarily confused by the business cards scattered across her nightstand. Had last night really happened? She picked up the topmost card, Eleanor Whitmore, board member, the Juilliard School, and the events of the previous evening came rushing back. After her performance, Sophia had been swarmed by guests eager to introduce themselves. Musicians, arts patrons, and music teachers had pressed their contact information into her hands, all promising opportunities. It had been overwhelming, like being caught in a sudden, bewildering storm of attention. Sophia's phone buzzed with a text message from Louisa next door. "How did rich people party go? Still have all your toes?" Sophia smiled. She hadn't had a chance to tell her neighbor about the unexpected turn of events. "You won't believe what happened," she texted back. "Got time for coffee?" 20 minutes later, they sat at the wobbly table in Louisa's slightly larger apartment, Sophia recounting the previous night's events while Louisa's eyes grew progressively wider. "Wait," Louisa interrupted, holding up her hand. "This millionaire jerk tried to embarrass you by making you play piano, but instead you blew everyone away with your mad skills, and now Juilliard might give you a scholarship." "That's pretty much it," Sophia confirmed, still sounding stunned herself. "But I don't know if anything will actually happen. Rich people make promises all the time when they're feeling emotional at parties." Louisa leaned forward. "Did you get paid at least?"
The $500?
"I completely forgot to ask," Sophia admitted. "Everything happened so fast after I played. The event coordinator never found me again. Girl, you better call and get your money. That was the whole point." Sophia nodded, but part of her wondered if it even mattered anymore. If even one of last night's offers was genuine, it would change her life far more than a single payment. Her phone rang. An unfamiliar number. Sophia hesitated before answering. "Hello, Sophia Martinez speaking." "Ms. Martinez, this is Diane Rodriguez from last night's event. Mr. Harrington asked me to call you." Sophia tensed. Was Richard angry about how the evening had played out? Was he going to try to withhold her payment after all? "Mr. Harrington would like to meet with you today if possible." "At his office downtown." Sophia glanced at the clock. She had a shift at the coffee shop in 2 hours. "What's this regarding?" "He didn't specify," Diane replied. "But he asked me to tell you that you will of course receive your payment for last night, regardless of whether you agree to meet." After getting the address and ending the call, Sophia looked at Louisa, who had been shamelessly eavesdropping. "Richard Harrington wants to meet me at his office." "The jerk who set you up? Why would you go?" "I don't know," Sophia admitted. "Curiosity, I guess. And I need to get paid." Louisa looked worried. "Just be careful. Men like that don't like being shown up, especially by someone they thought they could push around." An hour later, Sophia stood in the lobby of a gleaming skyscraper in Midtown, feeling desperately out of place in her simple jeans and sweater. The receptionist eyed her skeptically until she mentioned Richard's name, then immediately directed her to the express elevator to the executive floor. Richard's assistant, a polished woman with an elegant scarf tied around her neck, led Sophia into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Richard stood as she entered, his expression impossible to read. "Sophia, thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please sit down." Sophia perched on the edge of the seat, wary and confused. On his desk sat a familiar envelope. "Your payment for last night," Richard said, sliding it toward her. "Plus a bonus." Sophia didn't reach for it. "Why a bonus?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "Let's call it an apology." "You're apologizing?" "Don't look so shocked," Richard said with a hint of his usual dryness. "Contrary to popular belief, I can recognize when I've been less than admirable." Sophia waited, not sure how to respond. Richard sighed, the carefully constructed facade slipping just a little. "I invited you to that party to embarrass you. I thought it would be entertaining to watch a waitress who claimed to play piano fumble through a simple tune on an instrument worth more than she'd make in years." He met her eyes directly. "I was wrong, and I'm not often wrong, Ms. Martinez. So this is, what, guilt money?" Richard almost smiled. "You don't make it easy, do you?" "No, it's not guilt money. It's fair compensation for an exceptional musical performance that became the highlight of my otherwise predictable charity gala." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "Eleanor Whitmore called me this morning. She was quite impressed with you." Sophia's heart skipped. She was serious about Juilliard? Eleanor doesn't say things she doesn't mean. She's arranged for an audition next week. Special consideration outside the normal application cycle. Sophia felt dizzy. I can't prepare for a Juilliard audition in a week. I don't even have proper sheet music. Or a decent piano to practice on. Richard turned back from the window. That's actually why I asked you here. I'd like to help. Help? Sophia repeated skeptically. Why would you help me? Let's call it enlightened self-interest, Richard replied. Last night my attempt to embarrass you backfired spectacularly. But it also turned my forgettable charity event into something people will talk about for months. Remember the Harrington Gala where that waitress played Liszt better than professionals? It's good publicity, Miss Martinez. Sophia frowned. So you want to use me again? This time as some kind of success story? I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement, Richard said smoothly. You need resources to prepare for your audition. I can provide those resources. In return, your success reflects well on the Harrington Foundation's commitment to arts education. What exactly are you offering? Sophia asked, still suspicious. Access to a proper piano for practice, sheet music, and a stipend to cover your living expenses so you can take time off work to prepare properly. Sophia stared at him. Why should I trust you after what you tried to do? Richard actually looked uncomfortable for a moment. You shouldn't, but the offer is genuine. I've had my assistant draw up an agreement. No strings attached, no public appearances required. Consider it reparation for my misjudgment. He handed her a folder containing several typed pages. As Sophia scanned them, she realized it was exactly what he'd described. Financial support, access to a practice space with a quality piano, and a professional coach to help her prepare for the audition. All with no obligations on her part. This is generous, she finally said. It's the least I can do, Richard replied. And frankly, I'm curious to see how far your talent can go with proper support. So I'm still entertainment for you, Sophia observed, but without real anger. Richard smiled slightly. Perhaps, but this time on your terms. Sophia thought for a moment. She could refuse on principle, walk away with just her payment for last night and take her chances with the Juilliard audition on her own. But that would mean continuing to practice on a subpar keyboard and the community center piano, working double shifts up until the audition, arriving exhausted and underprepared for the opportunity of a lifetime. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. I accept, Sophia said finally. But I want something else. Richard raised an eyebrow. Name it. The community center where I practice, they need a new piano. The one they have is falling apart. Consider it done, Richard said without hesitation. Anything else? Sophia shook her head, surprised by his easy agreement. Then I think we have a deal. Ms. Martinez. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Sophia shook it. As she left the office building, envelope and folder clutched in her hand, Sophia felt strangely lightheaded. 24 hours ago, she had been a waitress and barista, practicing piano in stolen moments and dreaming of a life that seemed forever out of reach. Now she had a Juilliard audition, financial support, and access to a proper piano. All because a wealthy man had tried to humiliate her. Life was strange sometimes. Over the next week, Sophia lived in a whirlwind. She gave notice at both her jobs, moved her few belongings into a small but clean sublet closer to the practice studio Richard had arranged, and threw herself into preparation for the audition. The piano in the studio was a Yamaha Grand, not quite as magnificent as Richard's Steinway, but still the finest instrument Sophia had ever had regular access to. Her fingers seemed to come alive on the responsive keys, finding nuances and colors she had only imagined before. Anton, the coach Richard had hired, was a retired concert pianist with a reputation for being brutally honest. At their first meeting, he had listened to Sophia play without expression, then simply said, "You have extraordinary natural ability. Now we must see if you also have the discipline." What followed was the most intense musical education Sophia had ever experienced. Anton pushed her mercilessly, criticizing her technique, challenging her interpretations, demanding more emotion, more precision, more subtlety. Some days she left their sessions feeling exhilarated. Other days she fought back tears of frustration. But she never considered quitting. This was the chance she had thought lost forever. Every criticism, every repeated passage, Every aching muscle was bringing her closer to the dream she had abandoned years ago. 3 days before the audition, Richard unexpectedly appeared at the studio during her practice session. He stood silently by the door, listening as she worked through a particularly challenging passage of a Beethoven sonata. When she finished, he spoke for the first time. "How is the preparation coming along?" "It's intense," Sophia admitted. "Anton is undemanding." "The best usually are," Richard replied. Eleanor called again. "She's assembled quite the panel for your audition. The dean will be there." Sophia felt a flutter of panic. "No pressure or anything." Richard studied her for a moment. "Are you ready?" "I don't know," Sophia said honestly. "But I'm as ready as I can be with 1 week of proper preparation." Richard nodded. "That's all anyone can ask." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you'll surprise them." "You certainly surprised me." After he left, Sophia returned to the piano. She played late into the night, losing herself in the music, letting her fingers tell the story of a girl who had nearly lost her dream, only to find it again in the most unlikely circumstances. As midnight approached, Sophia finally gathered her sheet music and prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring more practice, more criticism from Anton, more preparation for the most important performance of her life. But tonight, as she locked the studio door behind her and stepped into the quiet street, Sophia allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten: joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy in the music that had always been her truest voice. Whatever happened at the audition, no one could take that away from her again. The morning of the audition arrived with a gray sky threatening rain. Sophia had barely slept, her mind racing through passages of music, imagining every possible mistake she might make. She'd risen before dawn and practiced finger exercises silently on her bedspread, afraid that playing actual piano so early would disturb the neighbors. By 9 o'clock, she stood outside Juilliard's imposing entrance, her hands cold despite the mild fall temperature. Students streamed past her, instrument cases slung over shoulders, chatting casually as if entering this hallowed building was an everyday occurrence. For them, it was. Sophia wore the nicest outfit she owned, a simple black dress borrowed from Louisa again, paired with the one good pair of shoes she'd splurged on years ago for job interviews. She'd pulled her hair back neatly, applied minimal makeup, and now stood frozen, unable to make herself climb those final steps. You won't get in standing on the sidewalk. Sophia turned to find Anton, her coach, watching her with an amused expression. He'd arrived without her noticing, impeccable as always in a tailored suit that had seen better days but still spoke of quality. "I don't know if I can do this," Sophia admitted. "Of course you can," Anton replied matter-of-factly. "You've played these pieces hundreds of times this week. The notes are in your fingers now." "It's not the notes I'm worried about." Anton's face softened slightly. "The rest of it? The judgment, the opinions, the feeling of not belonging?" When Sophia nodded, he continued, "That never goes away, not really. Even after 40 years on stage, I felt it before every performance. The trick is to use it. Use it how? Channel it into the music. Let it fuel your playing rather than hinder it." He glanced at his watch. "Now, shall we? Being late won't make a good first impression." Inside, the building hummed with creative energy. Students practiced in corners, teachers hurried between classrooms, and the distant sound of various instruments created a chaotic symphony that somehow worked. Sophia followed Anton through the maze of hallways, trying not to gawk like the outsider she was. They were directed to a waiting area outside a large rehearsal room. Through the small window in the door, Sophia could see a grand piano positioned in the center of the room, and several people seated at a table facing it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Remember," Anton said quietly, "they're not looking for perfection. They're looking for potential, for musicality, for something that can't be taught. You have that in abundance." Before Sophia could respond, the door opened, and a young woman with clipboard in hand called her name. "Miss Martinez, they're ready for you." Sophia rose on shaky legs. Anton gave her a single nod, the closest thing to affection she'd seen from him, and then she was walking into the room alone. 5 people sat at the table, 3 men and 2 women, all with the slightly intense look of people who had devoted their lives to music. Among them, Sophia recognized Eleanor Whitmore, who offered a small, encouraging smile. "Good morning." "Miss Martinez," said the man in the center, whose silver hair and authoritative posture marked him as someone important. "I'm Dean Fletcher. We understand your circumstances are somewhat unusual." Sophia nodded, unsure what to say. "Mrs. Whitmore has spoken quite highly of your performance at Mr. Harrington's event," the dean continued. "We're interested to see if that was a one-time phenomenon or evidence of genuine talent." The bluntness of his statement should have intimidated her, but instead, Sophia felt a flicker of determination. They didn't believe it. They thought she might have gotten lucky, or that the wealthy partygoers had been easily impressed by a server who could play a few notes. She walked to the piano without being told, adjusted the bench to her height and took a deep breath. Then, without introduction, she began to play. She started with Bach, a prelude and fugue that showcased technical precision and understanding of musical structure. The notes flowed from her fingers with a clarity that filled the room. She kept her eyes on the keyboard, focusing entirely on the music rather than the panel watching her. When she finished the Bach, she moved directly into the Beethoven sonata she had been practicing with Anton, the Appassionata, with its stormy emotions and technical challenges. Here she allowed herself to be more expressive, letting the dynamics swell and fade with the emotional content of the piece. Throughout her playing, the panel remained silent, their faces neutral. Sophia couldn't tell if they were impressed or disappointed, but she pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about the music, about showing what she could do with this opportunity that had fallen into her lap through the strangest of circumstances. For her final piece, she had chosen Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, a technically demanding work that would showcase both her skill and musicality. As she played the thunderous chords and lightning-fast passages, Sophia felt something shift inside her. The nervousness fell away, replaced by a pure connection to the music that made everything else fade into the background. When the final chord resounded through the room and slowly died away, Sophia sat motionless for a moment, coming back to herself. Then she rose and turned to face the panel. The room remained silent. Dean Fletcher's face was unreadable, but Sophia noticed that one of the women had put down her pen and was simply staring, while another panel member had leaned forward in his seat. "That was—" Dean Fletcher began, then paused as if reconsidering his words. "Unexpected. Where did you train, Ms. Martinez?" asked one of the other men, a tall man with glasses perched on his nose. "I had lessons from ages 4 to 16, Sophia explained. "After that I practiced when I could, where I could. Without formal instruction for the past 10 years? The man clarified, his eyebrows raised. Sophia nodded. "And the Rachmaninoff, who taught you that interpretation?" "No one," Sophia said simply. "I listened to recordings. I played it how it felt right to me." The panel members exchanged glances and Sophia's stomach tightened. Had she made a mistake? Perhaps her self-taught approach was considered amateur or inappropriate for a place like Juilliard. Dean Fletcher cleared his throat. "Ms. Martinez, would you mind stepping outside for a few minutes while we confer?" Sophia nodded and walked out, her legs feeling strangely numb. In the waiting area, Anton looked up expectantly. "Well, I don't know," Sophia replied honestly. "They didn't say much. They asked me to wait outside." Anton nodded. "That's normal. Don't read anything into it." They sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. Sophia's mind raced through her performance, picking out small flaws. A rushed passage here, a missed dynamic marking there. By the time the door opened again, she had convinced herself that she had failed completely. The young woman with the clipboard gestured her back inside. The panel's expressions had changed somehow, though Sophia couldn't quite read the shift. Dean Fletcher spoke first. "Ms. Martinez, your playing is—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Remarkable, particularly given your unconventional background." Sophia's heart leaped, but she kept her expression neutral, waiting. "There are technical aspects that need refinement," he continued. "Your fingering is occasionally unorthodox and your pedal technique requires attention." Sophia's hope began to fade. This sounded like a polite rejection. "However," the dean went on, "your natural musicality and emotional connection to the pieces is exceptional, and your technique, while unconventional, is still highly effective." He glanced at the others, who nodded in agreement. "We would like to offer you conditional acceptance to our undergraduate program. Beginning next semester." Sophia stared at him. not quite processing the words. Conditional? She finally managed to ask. You would need to complete some remedial theory courses, explained one of the women, and work with a technical coach to address certain fundamentals. But yes, we would like to accept you. With a full scholarship, added Eleanor Whitmore. As discussed, Sophia felt tears welling up in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. I won't disappoint you. We'll be watching your progress closely, Dean Fletcher warned. This is highly unusual and frankly a bit of a risk on our part. I understand, Sophia said, her voice steadier now. I'll work harder than anyone. We're counting on it, he replied. But there was a hint of warmth in his eyes now. Outside, after the paperwork had been explained and the next steps outlined, Sophia found Anton waiting. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. Well done, he said simply. They said my technique needs work, Sophia admitted. Anton shrugged. Of course it does. Everyone's does. But they can teach technique. They can't teach what you naturally have. As they walked out of the building together into the crisp fall air, Sophia felt oddly calm. The frantic energy that had propelled her through the past week had settled into a quiet certainty. This was real. This was happening. Anton, she said suddenly, would you keep working with me? Even after I start classes? The old pianist looked surprised. They'll assign you instructors far better than me. Maybe, Sophia agreed. But you took a chance on me when I was just a waitress who played piano. I'd like to keep learning from you if you're willing. A rare smile crossed Anton's face. I suppose I could fit you in? Tuesday afternoons, perhaps. 3 months later, Sophia sat in Juilliard's main concert hall, watching as workers installed a plaque on the wall. The Martinez Harrington Scholarship for Exceptional Talent in Unconventional Circumstances, it read, announcing a new annual full scholarship. What do you think? Asked Richard, standing beside her. It's a bit much, isn't it? Sophia replied, still uncomfortable with seeing her name displayed so prominently. Not at all, Richard countered. Your story inspired the donors. A waitress who became a concert pianist? People love that narrative. Sophia had indeed become something of a local celebrity after a New York Times article about her unusual path to Juilliard. She'd even performed at a small recital, which had been attended by several of the guests from Richard's fateful party. Still playing at the community center? Richard asked. Every Sunday afternoon, Sophia confirmed. The children loved the new piano. The gleaming baby grand Richard had donated had transformed the humble music program. Sophia now volunteered there weekly, teaching piano to kids who, like her younger self, had talent but limited resources. You know, Richard said thoughtfully, a year ago, if someone had told me my attempt to embarrass a waitress would lead to funding a scholarship and donating a piano to a community center, I'd have said they were insane. Life takes strange turns, Sophia agreed. Sometimes humiliation backfires in the best possible way. Richard laughed, a genuine sound that Sophia had come to recognize over the months of their unlikely friendship. Indeed it does. As they walked out of the concert hall together, the millionaire and the former waitress, now piano student, Sophia reflected on how completely her life had changed in such a short time. From double shifts and stolen moments at a community center piano to full days, immersed in music at one of the, world's premier conservatories, all because a wealthy man had tried to embarrass her at a party. Life was strange indeed. But sometimes, if you were brave enough to sit down at the piano when all eyes were watching, expecting you to fail, sometimes the music that followed could change everything.